And welcome back to Bulldawg Talk, the podcast where history and archaeology come alive. From the legendary wisdom of King Solomon to the uncontested narratives of today, we dig into the layers of time to uncover how the past is used to shape the present. In this land of history and deep conflict, archaeology has become more than just a tool for discovery, it has become a battleground for narratives. Take Jerusalem, where Israel constructs a narrative of continuous Jewish presence to legitimize settlement expansion and consolidate control, sidelining Palestinian history and memory in the process. Join us today as we explore the crossroads of civilization, uncover artifacts of the past, and interrogate the stories that still echo through the land today. This isn't just history, it's a journey into the heart of a region where every stone tells a story and every story holds power. Let's dig in. I'm Campbell Larry Hart, history major at the University of Georgia, and I'm joined by two of my greatest friends here. Please introduce yourselves.
Well, Jack, go
You
ahead.
said, I thought you, okay. I'm Jack Soderman, history major at the University of Georgia, and I'm here to introduce one of my greatest friends, Jim Hovis. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Jack Soderman of the
And
University of Georgia. My name is Jim Hovis, and I'm a history major and religion major.
Now, Jim, to start us off, I heard you had a pretty interesting take on how Israel has used archaeology to kind of push a national identity, so to speak.
Yeah, when you think about, of course, ancient Israel, it was kind of an ancient polity that existed towards the end of the Bronze Age collapse. So around the middle of the first millennium BC until about 500 BC, when it was, or 600 BC rather, when it was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. And this polity produced a lot of written works, a lot of tablets, a lot of monuments and structures that still survive to this day. Part of a general kind of Phoenician Canaanite culture that it emerged out of, that is well attested, and by the Romans as far as the Punic Wars go, with the Phoenician colony of Carthage. You do see lots of overlaps between names and places like Carthage and in the Bible. And so it's just general culture that did exist. It was, kind of pretty recognizably Jewish. You would, with terms of the names of people, the language spoken, the language written, pretty similar to what we know today with rabbinical Judaism.
how
Now,
similar is modern Hebrew to ancient Hebrew? I heard it was different, but I don't know the extent of that.
I'm not 100% sure the extent of the difference. I know biblical Hebrew is, a whole different animal to modern Hebrew, which I think you've explained to me in the past that you find modern Hebrew very similar to Arabic.
I
And
do, and I don't know how much that
um,
holds true with biblical.
an interesting thing with Arabic and Hebrew is, if you think about like kind of the scale of like language families branching off and coming down, like a tree kind of. The Semitic language family, you would find Hebrew and Arabic on the exact same rung almost. They kind of co-developed in a similar region. They use a writing system derived from the same source of Egyptian hieroglyphs. They're very, very, very similar. And you think, of course, like the Palestinian culture that we think of, as part of the Arab side of Israel. That comes from the term the Philistines, which was another group that existed back then. So kind of these kind of continuous cultures that do exist and kind of develop up together.
I'll say Philistine. Philistine is still the Arabic name for Palestine. There's no
Yes,
P there.
indeed.
So,
Indeed.
um,
Now, of course, there's an interruption with the Romans scattering Jewish diaspora and destroying Jerusalem in 70 AD. And in that time, there was a kind of a nominal Jewish presence in the Levant that did coexist with their Christian and Arab and Muslim neighbors, but overall was not kind of a coordinated like political force. Now, until the Shuv pops up, which are these kind of organized settlements that start arriving in beginning with Ottoman Palestine and moving into the British Mandate following World War One. These are kind of utopian kind of societies. They're not looking to the Bible and thinking, about religion. Kind of looking to the soil and thinking about, here's the future. Here's like, we're not looking to the past anymore. You think like kind of a utopian socialist viewpoint would talk about, like the nationalism is like a false consciousness or something. So they would not identify with kind of a religious side of Zionism. They would kind of more think about the kind of hope it would bring and kind of the potential it had rather than what it was. As far as like the right to the land given by God or something. Now, this does start to change, and it changes with somebody who is very familiar to somebody you're familiar with, Jack. His name is Eliezer Lipa Sukunek. Now, do you know who that is?
No,
Well, that is the father of Yigael Yadin, prominent Israeli, prominent Israeli, prominent Israeli archaeologist. You sound surprised.
there are a lot of names here. I'm gonna be honest,
No,
and
that's
this
fine.
was some weeks ago.
Now, compared to his son Yadin, of course, Sukunik is kind of more of a footnote character, but he does kind of provide this kind of important background, kind of base plate to build off Israeli archaeology into what we are studying here today with this podcast. Now, Sukunik, he attended in the like the late 19th century, early 20th century. He attended university in Berlin. He taught as a teacher of archaeology in Mandatory Palestine, or teacher of geography rather. He studied archaeology in Berlin. And while he was studying that in Berlin, he was kind of consumed by this kind of Volkish national movement, or he would have been rather. This was kind of a movement that existed in Germany at the turn of the century, very much associated with German nationalism and what it develops into with, of course, the Nazis later on. But overall, if you look at it, it can be best compared to like the German Romanticism you see in art around the same period. These kind of overwhelming, divine, kind of natural state, kind of Germany. My favorite one, probably to illustrate this, would be the Chasseur in the Forest by Caspar David Friedrich. What that painting describes is kind of this lone French soldier up against a towering wall of the German Black Forest. Just massive pines, just being, kind of totally consumed, kind of a celebration of victory in the Franco-Prussian War, no doubt. And very much a kind of nationalist sentiment that's rooted in this kind of deep mystic belief in like a greater people, so to speak. And part of that, romanticism is romanticized the past, as the, Chasseur in the Forest romanticizes the older wars with France and, the kind of German ingenuity and German spirit breaking the French advance. You see this return also in the work of Sukunik. When he returns to Mandatory Palestine at the settlement of Beit Alpha, they actually dig up this kind of partial mosaic of a Jewish structure. And this is according to the historian Amos Elon, who's writing this essay talking about Sukunik's role in promoting a scholarly kind of interest in digging up this past and restoring this mosaic and using it kind of as a symbol of like Jewish perseverance all this time later. Because if you imagine the status of a settler on the Levant in the very early parts of the Mandatory Palestine period, very rough, first, second Aliyah, it's, Levantine farming and agrarianism, especially before, the mass irrigation that we see with Israel. It's difficult. It's a hard life. It's not something that you would be used to coming from Russia or coming from Germany or coming from, kind of a less, I guess, hot European nation, so to speak. And so you can imagine morale was pretty low at these sites. They were kind of, the continued hostility of their Arab neighbors who wanted them gone more than else. You can imagine there was a sense of why are we here even, like why we should just go find somewhere else. This place is just as rejecting to us as our land back home. However, Sukunik's role in kind of rediscovering, kind of re-emphasizing the importance of Jewish artifacts in the Holy Land gives a renewed motivation for these settlers to kind of continue persevering, kind of using these symbols that they're digging up in the dirt is almost like kind of a rite, like a way of communing with this ancient people who may have until that point have been known to them through biblical scripture, which utopian socialists would have no real need for.
Well, I will. When we were reviewing Tim's project, one of his interview responses was a Jewish guy who said, and the question was like, "Do you think the Jewish people have a claim to the land of Palestine or whatever?" And he says, "Yes, but not on religious grounds." And it's you imagine this sort of archaeological movement. I mean, it's totally necessary to marry like the secularist Zionist movement with this like appeal to the past.
And that's a very apt point that this and actually in Yadin's biography by the historian Neil Silverman, he describes it as a tangible means of communion between the people and the land. Kind of, and using that religious term communion, although within regards to a scientific medium of archaeology. So it's very much a secular way of, having this connection to a land who, otherwise your only connection is the tenuous, promise from a religious deity. Now you actually have a physical, provable, scientific, explanation for why the Jewish people are in Palestine, because they've always been. But the kind of the increased archaeological interest that developed in the wake of Sukenik's kind of promotion. This interesting word that I've read called bulmus, which is Talmudic Jute. It's a word for rage, a mania, a craze, or a ravenous hunger following prolonged fasting. Kind of maybe, if I were more of a poetic person, maybe a fasting for hope or something. It's this kind of need to justify why you're there. And,
Jim, you talk about sorry. You talk about talking about reconstructing like the past, which absolutely is what's going on. I think we might begin with the end kind of and talk about Masada.
Go ahead.
So one of the more important Israeli excavations, and this has really been central to Zionist nationalism from the 20s onward, when you have Yitzhak Lemd in this poem, which is really entirely divorced from history. It's got no basis. He heard the name once, probably, and it seems like he didn't hear any more about it. It's not really until Yigael Yadin, the son of Sukenik, that this myth really starts to take shape. But I'd like to really establish this one character. How much do we know about Flavius Josephus, boys?
Not much.
I know a little bit.
So Flavius Josephus is this upper class, high caste priest, son of a long line of priests, a very articulate writer, and he is the only surviving extant source concerning the Masada that's contemporary to it. We have a couple more that are 10, 20, 30 years old. Flavius Josephus is like within a couple of years. It's questionable whether or not he actually witnessed. In fact, it's likely he didn't witness anything that he's describing. But he's contemporaneous enough that it is significant. So 66 AD, the Great Jewish Revolt begins. This is the beginning of the end. The Second Temple falls in 4 years. The Jews are scattered by the Romans. But what's interesting is 4 years after the Second Temple's gone, or 3 years after the Second Temple's gone, in 73 AD, Masada is still here, and there's still this group of 697, maybe. Actually, one thing that's interesting, the modern archaeological record has more or less confirmed, like it's hard to confirm with any specificity, but it seems like that's the correct number, which lends some more credence to Josephus's narrative. 697 Jewish rebels. They recognize the imminent Roman capture of the fortress, kill each other. And this is very significantly, we'll come back to this in a second, but this is in accordance with Jewish prescript because they kill each other. Suicide is forbidden, but killing each other somehow is a loophole. And then like the last 3 kill themselves, and I guess they go to hell. And this is one of the largest mass suicide events in history. It did happen, so it is one of the largest mass suicide events in history. Jody Magnus, historian over at Princeton, has pointed out that there are some pretty obvious flaws with relying on only one account of this event. Josephus's account, you read him, and he's a weird guy because he's writing a couple years after even the Masada has fallen. So all the Jews have been scattered to the wind. He is still living in Jerusalem at this time, very much because he's upper class. So he has this direct kind of material interest in pleasing his Roman overlords, who are none too pleased with the Jews, and palliating any sort of resistance or mollifying any sort of resistance that might still remain in the Jewish population. So he is at once writing apologia, kind of pleading with the Romans, this was wrong and this is terrible. You guys are bad, because we're going to get to the narrative and it does not reflect well on the rebels. And also, it's an entreaty to the Jewish population not to rise up against Rome's imperial might. So despite the fact that there's some pretty outstanding problems, he's our only source, so we're going to progress with him. It's also worth noting, there are a few main versions of this story, really three forms that the myth takes. And I would like to point out that every side claims that they are the one that is corresponding with Josephus's narrative.
Naturally.
Yeah, of course. Here, I think it's apt to consider Nachman ben Yehuda's interpretation of Josephus. Ben Yehuda is one of the main revisionists of the traditional myth, and he's actually revising the second myth. But we'll get to that. He is fairly academic, fairly detached, but he does present kind of an alternative myth, which I don't really have any interest in getting into. But his kind of version of the story is that when Yigael Yadin was writing his study and planning out his excavation, he actually picked and chose pretty egregiously with the Josephus text. Ben Yehuda points out that Josephus writes that the people on Masada are largely Sicarii. The Sicarii, they're terrorists, essentially. And they're not terrorists against the Romans. Josephus describes them raiding surrounding Jewish villages. He does kind of go to pains to point out their devotion to God, to Yahweh, which is a bit strange, but it's not out of the question. It does seem, from investigations into the surrounding area, it does now seem that that's accurate. These were raiders, and they were certainly not Jewish freedom fighters. They certainly did not represent any sort of national ethic, which also did not really exist at the time. Ben Yehuda also points out that there might not have been any fighting at all. Josephus is very vague about it. He doesn't actually describe the siege. We only even have a time frame from his implication. But the time frame is, and it's not 3 years. It's not 3 years of conflict from 70 to 73. These guys run into the desert and they hole up on this mountain. And Rome kind of lets them be for 2.5 years. The siege takes anywhere from 4 to 8 months. Again, it's an implication, so we're not sure. But even still, it doesn't seem like there was direct, it doesn't seem that any casualties occurred until they all killed themselves. Even at this point, it does not seem like the majority of people on Masada, from Josephus's account, it does not seem like the majority of them were particularly eager to commit suicide. Go figure, they had to be talked into it. So there was this very small band of zealots, which Josephus does kind of agree with. Yadin really terms them all as zealots. Josephus is like, there are these 10 zealots who want everybody to kill themselves. And eventually they do win out and everyone kills themselves. And so we are brought to the Masada narrative. And I think it's time to address elephant in the room, guys. Who the hell is this Yigael Yadin character? I mean, this guy's a nut job.
I know.
1966. Yigael Yadin publishes Masada, Herod's Fortress, and the Zealots' Last Stand. Very dramatic. It is an exaggeration, a perpetuation, and a reimagining of the existing Masada myth. I said that there earlier that there were two myths before the revision. Um, Yadin's really kind of begins the second. I mean, he doesn't, it's not exactly, but the second myth really takes hold after the Yom Kippur War and Israel's defeat. They felt like it was a defeat. Um, so the first myth and it begins really with, as I stated earlier, Yitzhak Lamdin's epic poem Masada. It's just one word. Published in 1927, so the presence that Jim describes, the Yishuv is really already on the ground and conceptualizing themselves, but not in incredible numbers. I mean, it's not until the 30s that immigration really begins in full. But 1927, Lambdin writes this epic poem, and it really emphasis on the epic and the poem. Really, I'm glad I did not say historical because it's really not at all. Total myth, very egregious. I mean, this is really comparable. This is like the Jewish Iliad. Like maybe Troy was real, maybe there was a war there, but probably not, and definitely not the gods or whatever.
Yeah. I was gonna ask, how long is it? How long is the poem?
The poem? It's not long. I don't know why they call it an epic poem. It's a couple pages. Like it's a pamphlet. It's an epic pamphlet.
Interesting.
So Lambdin's epic pamphlet. It's just, I mean, it's total hookum. There's not really any point in getting into it, because the effect that it has on the conscience is only to introduce Masada as a real like point of interest. It's really does nothing else. Even Lambdin's kind of like what he tries to associate with the Masada doesn't really stick. Let me tell you what does stick. Masada becomes conceptualized, especially after 1945, when it really takes hold, when the state of Israel is first founded, with an idea of no more, you know? The Jews have undergone, I mean, the last 600 years of history from their perspective begins with the Spanish Inquisition, goes all the way through, I mean, hundreds of European pogroms, blood libel, and finally it's culminated in the Holocaust. And from their perspective, they took it kind of laying down. Not a ton of pushback from the Jews on any of those, really. There's this sense in Israel at the time that the Holocaust, I not at this time, but later it will come about that the Holocaust is like almost seen as like partially on the Jews, or not on the Jews, but like they did nothing. Like it's really emphasized that they just laid down and took it. And this is like a point of national embarrassment. The Masada myth acts as a sort of rectification of this. Masada is really the first time in the modern Israeli history that they're bringing up an instance of, yes, their defeat, but a very heroic stand. That's how it's presented, is this very heroic stand. And I do want to also mention Shmeria Gutman and Eliezer Sukenik. Gutman is the man who actually convinces Yadin to go along on this project. Yadin was not a fan of the myth. He thought that it was fairly ahistorical. And he had not bought into it. I mean, Gutman, this is the guy who's totally drunk the Kool-Aid. I mean, this guy is totally gone. He really believes it. He is so devout in his belief in this myth that he is like begging Yadin to excavate because he's so certain any excavation will confirm what he already knows to be true. Eliezer Sukenik, as Jim has pointed out, I would like to point out Sukenik's emphasis on ethnography. At the time, ethnography was huge. It was very in vogue in Germany. There's a funny, when I was reading Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, it's written in 1904. And he has this whole like long like footnote where he goes into like, some people would say that ethnography is useful here. But it's actually just a nascent field and maybe it'll be really good. But at present, we can't say how useful it'll be, but it seems promising, which is just funny to me. You don't really always see like the origins of this kind of like like huge evil. And it's one that Suganik bought into entirely. You have to imagine that Yigael Yadin was brought up with an attention to these ideas. And when he publishes his report, it seems like absolutely. His activity, I think, Jim, you had something about what's his activity in 1948? I really was unsure what he was doing over there.
And Sukenik was doing in 1948.
No, sorry, yeah, Yadin, Yigael Yadin.
Well, Yigael Yadin was the commander of military operations for Israel in the 1948 war. Sukenik actually at the same time was also identifying the Dead Sea Scrolls from Iran.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
Very interesting. A little bit closer time period, around 1966, 1963. Goodman kind of succeeds in convincing Yadin to go after this. It's not exactly a prize, but it is worth a lot to certain investors. I mean, Yadin gets 2 million USD adjusted for inflation to go on this excavation, which is I don't I really don't know the going rate for archaeological expeditions, but that seems pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Um, I think what's interesting about Yadin is his goal going into this. I mean, this is the 60s, back when they didn't know what history was or how to do it. And his purported goal is proving Flavius Josephus correct. Um, this would be a failing grade in a high school history class today. And then a 17-year-old would learn the word teleology and, really hold it against their teacher forever. Um, Yadin's actual approach is strange because aside from like avowing that he has a bias and agenda and he's working to prove that, his methods are actually pretty good. Most of the revision that has been done to the Yadin thesis is done on his takeaways. Almost none of his archaeological findings are ever called into question, which I think is, I don't know, not cool, just interesting. But even a cursory interaction with Josephus's work reveals that Yadin has departed from it in significant ways. As I described earlier, and Ben Yehuda's conception of the narrative, the Scaria Terrace, Ben Yehuda's does seem to be generally a more accurate interpretation of Josephus. Nobody's really sure how Yadin got here. It's not. He might not have just. He might have actually just skimmed. What's it called? Oh my God, I'm totally blanking. Josephus, and otherwise have just heard it through cultural osmosis. It's entirely possible. Um, in the course of his mission, it was second nature for Yadin and his cohort to transmute Masada from a historical narrative into a contemporary one. And what I mean by that is that Masada is, I mentioned earlier, this is the end, right? This is the end of ancient Israel. It's very significant because what Yadin and his excavation does is they tie this to the start of modern Israel. Everybody knows that Israelis hate the diaspora, and it was way worse back in the day. So after 1948, when the state of Israel is really founded and the sense of sort of national pride is incredibly strong, the first Masada myth plays a significant role in creating a sense of antipathy for the diaspora and in kind of cutting them out of the historical record. Yadin has really tied seamlessly the fall of Masada right into the beginning of the state of Israel with very little attention to any of the tragedies in between. This was fairly necessary for the coherent existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. As Jim has pointed out, it's really difficult to make a secular case for Israel. You have to moralize a lot, as we saw with Jabotinsky, or the labor Zionists of the 30s. And it really does help immensely to have this sort of historical basis for your work. I would also, Jim mentioned that, actually, I'm not sure if you did mention this. Did you mention the Yadin faith quote?
The Yadin faith quote?
So Yadin goes on, he describes young Israelis' relationship with the past as a faith in history or in archaeology, a kind of religion.
Yes.
Yeah, which is, I mean, what?
I would 100% agree.
1000%.
In fact, Amos Elon would call it national cult, so to speak, kind of a almost like religious adherence to like a scientific principle of archaeology. It's kind of strange.
Yeah. I mean, this really is kind of here's something else. I wasn't sure where to include this. Now's as good a time as any. Um, the Masada myth is obviously, I mean, this doesn't even need to be stated, very important to the Israeli national spirit and its development. Even today, it is not done anymore, but into the 90s, IDF swearing ins were happening on top of the Masada. I was actually ended the IDF oath in 1990s. Never again shall the Masada fall. This very famous line from Yitzhak Lamdin's poem. What is very funny to me, essentially everybody we are going to talk about here, except for the last guy, insists that the Masada is no longer significant to the Israeli national consciousness. And I was just wondering, can you guys think of any examples from like American? Do we have any like myths that are so like necessary to the American ethic, and we all believe them, and they're very like prominent, but we just all pretend they aren't real and we don't like them?
I really don't.
Or any country for that. It's a weird situation.
Yeah.
I mean, people talk about like remember the name. They talk about like, you know, back then, yeah, it was this big, rallying cry for going to war with Spain, big thing to unite them. But then they turn around and say, well, but actually they probably just their boiler exploded and it was like an accident. We just went to war. It's kind of like, and you can still go. Like I went to Arlington National Cemetery, and the mast of the USS Maine is still there.
Really?
Yes. And so, it's still kind of, even if it's, people still kind of say like, maybe we were woods a little far on that main thing. They still, you're still kind of, you can walk around and see like the remnants of, oh, hey, remember that? Like, remember when America was all upset about that?
I think the Maine might even be a little bit too arcane for this. I think like the Masada is such a like everybody knows and talks about it. It's so important.
Yeah,
nobody knows about the Maine anymore.
I just struggle with the telling everyone knows, but then nobody cares about. Like it's like
I know it's a weird like I don't know if there is one. I think the closest we get is like Manifest Destiny, where everyone knows, and I think a lot of Manifest Destiny like foundational myths are still like unchallenged in the American consciousness, but everyone knows you're not supposed to like it, so everyone's like that's terrible.
Maybe just
while believing a lot of it.
Stuff about maybe democracy or kind of like an American fight for democracy or something.
Yeah,
and then everyone says like it's for oil.
Oh, I thought you were like in the going even back to the American Revolution. What I think is so funny about America is we are not ashamed of anything. Like look at Hamilton, which is entirely like a historical fiction.
Yeah,
and we're like, this is who we are.
I don't know. Something about Hamilton though, kind of I don't know, gives me like Shakespeare vibes in the sense that it's like they're writing. Yeah, I know. Laugh at that because that is
it's a play.
But I'm just saying it's like just like this really like bad like ahistorical romanticization of like a leader that was around like 200 years ago. That some people kind of know, but it just kind of totally like makes them a huge figure in the public consciousness again. That's how I would kind of compare it to Shakespeare.
No, I think you're right. I mean, Hamilton really does read like even going back to the first performance. I think everybody's seen that video where it's like Lin-Manuel Miranda performing it at the White House. Yeah. It really does feel like he was like being patronized by the leader of our kingdom.
Yeah, to
writing it on his dime.
Write a little poem for the great Alexander Hamilton.
He really is the modern Shakespeare. If Shakespeare were alive, we'd have like 8 Moana movies.
The patron of our dynasty. Yeah, that's awesome.
God, I'd kill to see Shakespeare's Moana. Sorry. So that's what's it called? So I don't think any of us are surprised that a religious nationalism, which is awkwardly what Zionism is, would have its justifications not only in nationalist ideology but in religion. So Yadin's work has kind of married this. There's this unification of religion and secularism in a kind of mythologized history. I would like to share a quote now.
Oh, please.
This is from unnamed, or his first name is lost. Why Glyph. I tried to search why Gliss Israel, and it came up with autofilled girls Israel, and it gave me the Maxim cover, like the IDF, like bikini photo shoots. And I was like, this guy, wow, he can really do it all. This is the quote from 1964. It said, this guy, Weigless, ultra Orthodox Jew. That's all I know about him. He's super Orthodox. And this is the quote. Again, 1964, 2 years before the Yadin book. There is propaganda focused on the excavations of Masada. This propaganda aims to place Masada at the center of Israeli life during the period of the destruction of the Second Temple. We must tell our children that Masada is not a symbol, that it never was a symbol, and that it will never be a symbol. This was specifically about the Yadin excavation. What do you guys think about that?
I think I don't know. I guess they risk kind of like we throw around the words like national cult and like communion and things in like a religious sense, but maybe this is like an actual warning against like stop creating holy sites, and basing your kind of nationality off of kind of something that may or may not prove to be true or eternal, like our divine like the belief is.
Interesting. I think that's a very accurate angle. The one I have here is different. Campbell, any guess as to why the ultra Orthodox Jews, the Haredim, hated the Masada myth so much?
No, I really don't know. I was gonna basically agree with Jim. I have a quote here.
Please
Well,
share.
I have several from Amos Elon. He's going
Okay.
into it, but it's just
Brag
talking
about it,
about
dude.
using archaeology as a pastime and how media coverage was telling people, go out there. And Jim's going to talk about this more later, but they were, the media newspapers were telling them take care of the remains, take care of them. Go out here, dig stuff up, but take care of it because this is our past, and it's a way to justify the land. The common claim was that it was not just the land that was theirs now; it was also the past. And by taking care of this past, it gives yourself legitimacy. So you have to keep those remains in check to kind of nurture your future. Take care of your past, nurture your future, kind of thing. So I have actually zero idea why he would deny the past, so to
I know
speak.
it was very surprising to me as well. It is very straightforward. It's just they don't like suicide. They think it's really wrong.
Okay, that's
It's
a little
bad, and it's
it's a little
bad in the
curveball.
Tanakh. Yeah.
No, that makes sense though.
It's really strongly condemned in the Tanakh. You know how like some Christians won't kill themselves because they think it'll send them to hell, and there's actually nothing about that in the Bible. It's just a holdover from Judaism because there is a lot about that in the Tanakh. It's actually very significant. So this is where you get kind of we could use the word imbrication. We could say elision, if we wanted to be like the worst about it. But this kind of marriage of secular and religion, it forgets a lot of both. And this is kind of the point of Zionism, the point of labor Zionism that I think we've been stressing really all semester long, is that this is a really awkward relationship, and you are losing a lot of the like real like integrity of secularism, and you are losing a lot of the like devotion and faith of religion. So it's like, what do you have left? And it's just a violent, really like antisocial narrative. I really like that Ernst Renan quote. A nation is a group of people with a shared misunderstanding about the past and a collective hatred of their neighbors. I really like that one, and I think probably does not describe any nation that has ever existed better than Israel.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm lost where I am, dude. I keep going off script here. So Masada's adoption by secular Zionists speaks to the commodification and fetishization of religion as a national signifier rather than any sort of cosmological or eschatological. What was I on here?
Eschatological.
Dude,
That's crazy.
Thank you, man. Cosmological or eschatological Polaris. What do you like that? Like the North Star, guiding light.
When I think of eschatology, I think of like dualism and like the fate of the soul.
Yeah, wait, eschatology. Wait. Oh, I forgot my camera.
Give me that jack chest, please.
Yeah. Yes, death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul. That's the thing. And I want to emphasize that when we get to Masada narrative 2, which we're about to, it is very much about death and finality. Um, but it's not in the way that like it's not leading you to a religious ending. It's not really leading you to a religious recourse for any of that. It is leading you very much to a nationalist and a pretty jingoist sentiment. I think it's worth pausing here and explaining what myth 2 is. So if myth 1, did I say what myth 1 was?
Well, go ahead.
Okay. Myth 1, myth 1 was that the yeah, I did. It's as I said, it's that the Masada is like this really crazy, unique example where the Jews stood up and they took their fate into their own hands. They did not go hands. They did not go quietly into that good night. They were not sheep to the slaughter. That is a phrase contemporary to this debate used by Israelis. I'm not anything I say here that could sound anti-Semitic was said by an Israeli about this debate.
Very well.
And it's about kind of like distancing from the diaspora, and it's about the heroism of these people. Myth 2 comes about after the 7 days, not after the 6 Days War, after the Yom Kippur War, the October War in 1973. This is 8 years after Yadin's thing is published. So Yadin had a good 8 years of being part of Myth 1, but now it's Myth 2's time to shine. And Myth 2 is all about tragedy. There is no heroism. It sucks that 700 Jews killed themselves. We're back on that. And this is really echoing the national sentiment after 1973, which is that Masada, that Israel is in danger existentially. The Arabs are back with a passion, and of course, this is not reflective of the actual geopolitical situation. But for many Israelis, that was the kind of anxiety of the day, and it was very widespread. So you get myth 2. Myth 2 emphasizes the tragedy, and it emphasizes not Masada's uniqueness or particularity, but Masada's just another link in the chain. It's just more Jews dying like always. Again, that is not something I said. But it is remembered in this way because it is intended as motivation. And here I want to bring in this phrase from Masada from the epic poem, from the epic pamphlet. Never again shall the Masada fall. This is really critical as a sort of lens into the idea of the Masada because it's used by every narrative. It is used by Yad. It's used by the pre-48 settlement Zionists. It's used today, and it was used for a long time, especially before the Second Intifada. It had a very storied history and use. Yeah. But pretty much both sides, any myth will claim this. And it's because, I mean, the myth is really like, at the end of the day, it is still pointing towards like a strong nationalism. These myths are in a way diametrically opposed to each other. And in another very real sense, they're indistinguishable. I think it's time to move on to maybe not myth 3, but we'll call it the revision, the rebuttal. So the rebuttal is to do with Ben Yehuda's book, which I mentioned earlier. And Ben Yehuda really calls this all out. Ben Yehuda, his narrative is much closer to the slavish Josephus myth that I described earlier. It's basically nothing. It has nothing to do with Judaism. It has nothing to do with zealotry. It has nothing to do with the Israelites. It is a group of people who happen to belong to those categories and really not zealotry even, who did some horrible things, but were fairly irrelevant and committed suicide. He does give an alternative myth, which I think I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but his idea is that one guy in particular saved all Jews by smuggling himself into a secret audience with a Roman general who allowed them out of Jerusalem to go to like a second city, which is also, made up. But here I think it's worth pointing out, and this kind of goes back to the sense of isolation, the existential crisis. This term was used for a long time in the 20th century. It is not so common anymore. Have you guys ever heard of the Masada complex?
No.
The Masada complex. So. It's not dissimilar from the Hitler or the pogrom complex. It is this idea that Israel is still that little group of zealots on the mountain surrounded by the Romans, and that any false move is going to make them fall. And they are committed very much to never again letting it fall. It is, I cannot stress enough how real of a link there is between the historical commodification of this like religious myth and a sense of isolationism. I mean, this myth really, it did not create that at all. But after the Yom Kippur War, it really reinforces this sense of existential crisis. And this kind of comes up time and again whenever there's a significant crisis after the Second Intifada as well. The Masada comes back into play, and it comes back into the Masada complex as well. Comes back into play. I think I want to talk about Masada in the modern age because I'm realizing I think I've spoken for 30 minutes.
Oh, go ahead.
Masada in the modern age, never again shall the Masada fall. And here I really want to talk about the fact that Ben Yehuda was blowing hot air as far as anybody was concerned. Nobody gave a shit. Nobody read his book. Nobody bought it. It was published in 1996, and it did not gain steam for a couple of years. Call it half a decade or more. Aside from some kind of outrage generated in the Israeli academia, nobody cared. It didn't have any impact. Everybody believed the same myth, and Ben Yehuda did not achieve his aims. Now, when does this change? It changes after Oslo, and it changes after the Second Intifada. It changes after 2005 in Hamas, when it really becomes clear that peace is not coming, at least not anytime soon. When it really becomes clear, and this is also after the Rabin assassination. Let me, emphasize that as a significant part of this history as well. When it becomes clear that Israel is still being attacked, will continue to be attacked, and in fact, it seems that the attacks will increase with seemingly no aid from any of Israel's purported allies. The U.S. won't kill Hamas. Britain won't drop a nuke on Hamas. We got to do it ourselves. And the Masada complex is really integral to this sense. But at the same time, this is when liberal Zionism is back on the menu. I think there's a period. I mean, obviously, we talked about the 70s after the occupation, and you have that guy going around, and he's the liberal Zionist, and he's like, "These guys have a real grievance. Life sucks under the occupation. They're not leaving. Maybe we should do something about that." And it's like him and three guys who think that. Well, now it's a few more than three guys. Now it is actually significant section of the population. And for the diaspora, it seems like that's the majority is liberal Zionists. In my experience, as an anecdote, that was kind of anti-Semitic. That was on me. Sorry, guys.
No problem.
But when liberal Zionism comes back on the menu, liberalism is really all about rehabilitating the same ideas that fascists have, but just holding on to them and pretending that they are not fascist. So liberals want to kind of, at the same time, they want the Masada myth and they want to be critical of it. What Ben Yehuda does, this is why I brought up Ben Yehuda's myth at all. Liberals kind of replace Ben Yehuda's myth with, they replace the second myth of Masada with Ben Yehuda's myth. And it fulfills really essentially the same function. It's a little bit less violent and bloody, but it is still kind of a made-up nationalist claim. And it is around this time that significant discussion of the controversy around the total invention of the poem, some of the questionable conclusions that Yadin drew, the entire second myth really being a product of cultural anxiety. This is when all that starts to be evaluated really for the first time by the Israeli public. And again, the myths are not going anywhere. The far right have held on to these beliefs. It seems like since the 2000s, where there was this wave of kind of embrace of the criticism, it doesn't seem like that's really led to anything. Masada, it's not as important as it once was, certainly. They've removed it from the IDF thing. Ceremonies are not held at the top of it, but it's still the main tourist attraction, most significant. It's still absolutely held on to as a piece of iconography, especially by the far right. And it's that far right that, I don't know, has succeeded a lot in preserving Masada as a myth against all else. It just really seems to me, I guess I'm really getting to my main takeaway, and I'm not really sure what it is. Masada has been this myth a few times. But I think it really harkens back to what Jim said at the beginning, which is that for Israelis and for Israeli culture, um, maybe that's being too narrow. Honestly, maybe we can say world culture, but it really is particularly strong in Israel that there is still a kind of like early 20th century scientific justification for an almost like religious, certainly imagined past. Their relationship with such a history is entirely faithful. It is predicated on belief and not evidence or analysis. And I think you can absolutely say the same things about America. You can say the same things about Britain, but they're a little bit more tongue in cheek about it. You can say the same things about Russia. I mean, that's the justification for the Russian conflict in Ukraine right now, right? But what's I think interesting to me is what Jim pointed out, which is how concrete sort of the foundations for this seem to be, or how concrete they try to make the foundations for these. Because with America, we talk about the founding fathers and the Sons of Liberty, and it's this very romantic idea, manifest destiny. It's this very romantic idea, but we don't so much use archaeology anymore. In fact, we're really unconcerned with the past as a kind of concrete entity. It's a very much a storytelling thing and a storytelling thing alone. It's almost as if in America and Britain and all these other places, we have not really progressed past the Yitzhak Lamden stage of the process, where we have an epic poem and we're kind of cool with it, and we skip over the turmoil where we're trying to prove it to ourselves, and we've just gone straight to the criticism and the intellectuals of the day, which would be us. We lucky few know that all that is bullshit, but I really do believe a wide swath of the population has no clue about that. And I think it's at least interesting to me. We've brought this up a couple times in discussions in Arab Israeli, and I'll conclude here. It's interesting to me how present all of these things are in Israeli discourse. I think
Yes.
that is probably a central part of why these things have sought such a concrete scientific justification. And I would love to ask Campbell if he knows of any other archaeological examples or cities from ancient Israel that have created such an idea
Oh,
or a myth.
oh boy, do I. So we'll go into Hebron. Um, it's one of the oldest cities in the Levant. It's important for both Jews and Muslims. I would argue more important for Muslims, but I'm a little bit biased. They had control over that city for 1300 years, right? Basically,
Right.
a long ass time. Um, but it's where the Ibrahimi Mosque is, or the Cave of the Patriarchs. So it's where the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and obviously Abraham, um, are put to rest. Um, but in 1967, so it was a completely Muslim Islamic city, and I want that to be known. I think that's important to know. The buildings are Islamic, the heritage is Islamic, it's Islamic culture, even still today. Um, but in
Were there
1967, go on.
there were we know we talked about the Haran massacre, so there were
Hmm.
definitely settlers there during like the
Yes.
early Mandate period. But was there significant Jewish because there were a lot of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews like in the Ottoman Empire before the first Aliyah. Were there any in this city at all, or was it just like a total overwhelmingly Muslim?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm fairly certain it's like overwhelmingly Muslim. There is a settlement um, not too far away, and the settlement was made by what Jim will talk about later, Moshe Dayan. Um,
Mm,
but I mean, it's an illegal settlement, but it has about
wow.
8,000 people, and if we do the Hebron
Well,
population.
they're all illegal settlements.
Well, this one is
That's
it's in the
redundant.
it's in the West Bank. I mean, yeah, but
Yeah.
this one is a bit more egregious. And yeah, I mean, I can't say like how outnumbered they are, but it's an Islamic
It's
city.
overwhelming. Yeah.
Um, and so in 1967, the Six Day War, um, they came in and they went into the Ibrahimi Mosque, obviously at the time, um, and gain control over the cave. And I mean, it's incredibly important for the settlers. Jewish people didn't have access to the site, and like they probably should have. But what I found interesting was upon going there. So it's important for both Muslims and Jews, as I've already stated. And after um, the IDF went in there, a chief rabbi of the IDF. He was the first to enter the cave, this big symbolic return to the cave, and he placed a flag, an Israeli flag, in the middle of it. Um,
They got to
and
stop doing that, man.
yeah, it's like he's he's Neil Armstrong on the moon. He's placing the flag down. Um,
Michigan and Ohio State, bro.
and so, and one of the quotes from another rabbi was, "It's clear to anyone that the sanctity of the city is linked to the cave, and those who sleep in Hebron, for us, the cave is the center of the city. For the rest of the city is worthless in relation to the gravesite."
Wow.
And I think that's what makes, the fact that it's an Islamic city important. Why I mentioned that, like, they don't care about anything around them, and I mean that's a generalization. These people, like in this instance, there's no care for anything around them except for the history that is theirs. They want to point to that, like that's my cave, and that'll come up in a second later at these archaeological parks. But it's just this deep admiration for the cave, specifically in this case. Um, Another person said it's the center of our life. The residents of Kiryat Arba, which is the settlement I mentioned earlier. At this point, the cave is a point of convergence between heaven and earth. It has all the spiritual power and the earthly power, and both of them together create a huge perfection, the Hebronian perfection. And it's just like this dismissal of the city itself, and just framing it as if the cave is the only important thing. And I think that's true. They only care for the cave, but it's important to note that because it's such an important site, control of the cave is control of the city. And this is a huge city in the West Bank. Like it's obviously incredibly important. There's no logical separation between the two. It is the historical and spiritual heartbeat of over the city, and having authority over the cave is authority over the land. And so, by placing the flag there, by repeatedly saying like this is the reason I live, this cave, by putting a settlement there and calling it the holiest. There's another one, the settlement, if I can find it. Um, I can't find it. It's in one of the books. Um, it's the Devere. They called another settlement near Mount Hebron Devere, and it just means like the holiest place. And it's like, well, why'd you call it
Hmm.
that? And it's like, okay, but the cave is just control of the cave is control of the land, and so it's just an extension of using their history with the cave. I control this. This is mine, and then we're gonna spread it around. Um, and then an extension of this is Tel Ramida. There's excavation sites really all over, but in 2014, there was a big one in Hebron, Tel Rumeda. I'm sure I'm butchering that, but one of the things you talked about um, a little bit about tourism and these archaeological sites. One at Rumeda, they found a Hebrew seal from the Bronze Age, and they're like, okay, this is our land. Like we found it. There's a seal. Like we have complete.
Like it's the deed.
Yeah,
Is that
basically.
wait? So you're saying Hebrew seal from the Bronze Age? Like, are you like? Is that like legitimately what it says?
Uh, like what the seal
Like it's
says. So
like actually from the Bronze Age? It's like a Hebrew from the Bronze
yeah, so
Age.
it is a it's like a name. There's a Hebrew name on the seal, like a name written in
Oh,
Hebrew on the seal.
like a
Um,
okay.
yeah, it's not like a yeah. So
I guess the only thing I think with Hebrew is we do associate that word with Israelite culture now.
yeah,
During the Bronze Age, Hebrew, which comes from the Akkadian Hapiru, uh, or I guess Egyptian, maybe Habiru, maybe reverse that. They are kind of these lower class, kind of outcast of society. It means the one across the river. And so it's just kind of like this little like it's like a class of the Jews become associated with, the Israelites become associated with, and then they become kind of synonymous with that class. I guess I'm sorry, I just was
oh
I,
yeah,
I
No,
was
no,
I,
no.
I was
That's
I
good.
thought I would be shocked if that were the actual case, but
no. And
you meant
so
like a name.
it was. If I can go to my thing real fast. So it was a seal and an ostracon found. Um, and with the names, it was just it showed that there was some sort of like administration there, an administrative, um, not power, but there was an organizational, there was
Mm.
structure there. People lived there, um, and it's another example of them using their history, their archaeology to further bite down on the claims of the land. In this case specifically, um, it becomes pretty extreme. So in 2014, when they made um, this site, they found this and they called it became a tourist route known as the Path of Biblical Hebron. And so you stop at the New Spring, and then you go, which is called the Spring of Abraham, and then you're taken to these various archaeological excavation sites, um, and this is one of them. And Palestinians are not allowed. Um, I can't show you the with the map I'm looking at, but um, there's like this red line that goes through it, completely cuts off. Palestinians are not allowed to cross that line. Basically, up to the cave, the tomb of the patriarchs, there's like this giant line um, in their city, this Islamic city, Palestinian city, in the West Bank, and they're just no longer allowed to go because we found a seal, and we're shutting this down for tourism. Um, and they're continually, digging stuff up, continually trying to um, find any sort of antiquity um, to further their claims of land. And what I found interesting, and Jim is going to talk about this from the past, is how entrenched it is, like from the top down. Like Netanyahu in 2014, Netanyahu was the one that was like this. He's a big member of the planning in this archaeological part. It's like, can you imagine if like Biden or Trump or whoever was like, all right, we're gonna have a archaeological park in Canyon, Texas. It's like, why? Like it just doesn't make
Archaeological
sense.
park is also such a funny phrase.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
ridiculous, but it's the archaeological park, and we're gonna bring thousands of people here, and we're gonna do this, and we're gonna do that, and it's just it's just an excuse, really, and that's my argument. Even though I'm rambling a little bit, it's like the cave, um, the excavation sites. They just allow Israel to construct a narrative of continuous presence in the city, serving as an attempt to legitimize their own settlement expansion. And when you look at Kiryat Arba, you look at Mount Devere, like they're succeeding, and they're sidelining Palestinian history and memory in the process. So, yeah. So Moshe Dayan, Jim, Moshe Dayan.
Oh, yes. Well, I just think that's really fascinating, you guys. I mean, I don't know if you want to just pause for a minute and talk about because you guys both. I mean,
Yeah,
that's really fascinating stuff. I mean,
I'm interested in the Hebron case. 'Cause you say Netanyahu. I'm always interested, like, how much do we think this is kind of a big picture question for the whole, I guess, thesis. This is really to do with everything. But how much do we think this matters anymore? Like, the
well,
Hebron is Jewish. It's been Jewish for, what, 80 years now? Since 1948. I wonder, like, not that I'm saying these things don't matter. I just wonder to the extent because, like, if Netanyahu's still fucking, going on his thing, which that guy needs to be off screen so quickly.
Oh,
But like, I'm just wondering, like, is this like who's the audience for this? Are they trying to convince themselves or their population? Are they trying to convince like the rest of the world? Is this just a fuck you to the Palestinians living nearby? What do you think, Campbell, in your reading?
I mean, I think it's just any way to justify that this really is our land.
Hmm.
Like any way to justify that. And I do think there is a bit of justification to oneself going on, like 1 billion%. Go on.
Well, okay. I think I can actually simplify my question a lot more. So, do you think this is like a material? They have like a reason, like they need to convince a certain like number of people, or do you think this is a product of like indigeneity anxiety?
I think it is an extension of a culture that was made in the 50s and 60s where, as Jim pointed, like it is a fervor. Like we are going to dig and we're going to find our past and we're going to verify our past. We're going to justify our existence here. Um, and that like that was strong in like if I can find it, I'm scrolling everywhere. So in like 1971, Elon talking about, they're not digging for objects, they're digging for reassurance of roots, which we've kind of already talked about. Um,
Mhm.
but from 1948 to 1967, the Israeli Department of Antiquities and Museums um, reported 641 excavations, um, and that's just them. And so that's a shit ton of excavations. Obviously, that's 60 years ago, but I mean that's a culture. This is a relative, like not even relative. This is a very new country. This is and so I think that culture is still there. We're gonna dig. We're gonna find our roots. You're not gonna just get rid of it until probably all the Palestinians are gone. But I think that's important to them. Fundamentally, I think it's an important thing for Israel.
But,
And
I
every
think that.
society kind of needs it. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, as far as like the strategy, like why is who's the audience for this? And honestly, it just seems like they're just kind of like almost like backtracking. Like they've already taken over this area. They already occupy the West Bank and kind of control
Mm.
it. Now they have to kind of go back and build up the settlements around, and cut them off and take over the land and do it through these kinds of, and archaeology is one of the many ways that they do this. And
Yeah.
just, to just kind of go back and, kind of, I guess in the sense that if you think of the settlements as being maybe some kind of leverage in one sense, as they were used, in places like the Sinai or the Golan Heights, um, you can really see them like kind of like just a policy of settlement construction happening, and then now you have to kind of go back and you know
Mm.
justify it, I guess.
And also, I mean, every country kind of needs their like national digging pastime. We did oil. Britain was coal. Israel has archaeology. This is just how
Yeah.
things go.
I guess so.
Do you think they have like a sports team named like the, I don't know,
No,
excavators? Give the
I
Oilers.
have no doubt that they've got some crazy sports teams over there.
See the Maccabees. That didn't blow
The
my mind exactly,
Maccabees.
but that's kind of crazy. That was well, we can not talk. That was crazy.
No, it's fine. I mean, I was gonna ask you, Jack, about Masada. Have you ever
Hmm.
heard of the Samson option within Israeli society?
God, it fucking sounds familiar. Could you remind me?
So Samson, of course, biblical figure, a judge. So he's a military leader in the Israelite
Hmm.
kind of Iron Age period of the Bible. During he kind of he marries a Philistine woman, but then I don't know if it's Delilah herself or if Delilah's another person who comes along, and she cuts off his beard or cuts off his hair, and it kind of keeps him from having his strength, and he's captured by the Philistines. And they
Hmm.
have this massive like kind of celebration ritual sacrifice to celebrate Samson being delivered into their hands, and they're sacrificing to their god Dogon. And Samson gets enraged, and so he physically grabs the pillars of the Philistine temple and pulls the whole thing down on everyone, killing like
Hmm.
1,000 Philistines or something. It's like this moment, and so you can imagine what that means in terms of Israeli nuclear deterrence policy.
Yeah.
And just one thing that they did a lot was contrasting it with as the Sakari and Masada killed themselves or wanted to be conquered by their weapons. Samson, kind of in the
Oh God,
face
yeah.
kind of like assault on Israelite dignity, decided he'd rather bring the whole thing down with.
Yeah, that's pretty harrowing, and terrible to think about because they definitely do have nukes. Um, you ever like talk to somebody about Israel who isn't in this class and like
Yeah.
they're like they don't have nukes.
My
They're really
grandmother
adamant about
did.
that.
My
They're like, there's
grandmother.
no proof
Well,
that they
yeah,
have.
it's fascinating. It's fascinating that the proof that we do have comes from like a satellite that just was able to catch the flash, and They were like, they thought it was like a meteorite burning up in the atmosphere or something, and they
Is that how?
finally,
Oh my God.
yeah, I think it was the Vega satellite that was watching, and it was like off the coast of South Africa or something. So it was a joint South African Israeli venture to develop
I
the
do
data.
remember that. I do remember that. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, as for the Samson policy, it's weird because, and we were talking about this earlier, how like Hebron and then the entire Hebron case is very much like establishing a link to the land. Masada feels a little bit more um like actual motivation and guide for the future. Like there's very little in the early days, certainly like the Yadin excavation, you look at, and I mentioned he was like tying it back to the end of the Israeli past and cutting out everything in between. So there's definitely that like connection, but it's not. It's really never as much of a justification. It's very much like what else it represents. Like that's what you're pointing out. Like the should we kill ourselves, whatever. Um,
Yeah,
and I definitely think the implications of Masada on like as like a national neurosis kind of. I think they're significant. I think they're enduring, and it definitely concerns me because they do have
yeah,
nukes.
yeah.
Yeah,
Especially within the nuclear. Yes.
not good to know. Hey, doesn't
But
it
yeah,
feel weird, Danny? Now that we like, I didn't know Philistine for a long time. I didn't know like until college. I didn't know that was like Palestine. And
yeah.
like they still call themselves that. You think it's weird that that means like a stupid, boorish, unintellectual person?
No, because in the Bible, that's how they're depicted as the enemies of the Israelites.
Hmm.
They're
I don't know
depicted
about the
as
Bible.
these kind of rough,
Pick one up,
kind
read
of
it.
foolish. Yeah, that's why
Jesus,
that's the
guy.
case.
Okay.
The
All right,
Philistines
that's interesting.
originally, in case you're interested, at the end of the Bronze Age, the collapsed kind of Aegean peoples, so people around Greece, so people kind of also on the Italian peninsula, people in Spain too. We're kind of in this mass migration mode as like society collapsed, and a large coalition, possibly of Greek forces, or just maybe just bands of raiders from different Greek areas, pillaged up and down the Levantine coast into Egypt, and they're called the Sea Peoples. And I think it's pretty definitively proven the Philistines were kind of one of the Sea People tribes that managed to kind of gain a foothold and settle. And they have like kind of a
Yeah,
very distinct Aegean kind of culture.
I really hate. I think like that's the most Reddit thing in the world is that shit where people be like, "Who were the Sea Peoples? What were they doing? Why did they just? Oh my God, they're so
Yeah,
badass."
very,
That's the, like
very.
we know, dude. We obviously
And
know. It's really easy,
not only do we
actually.
know, not only do we know, we have like if you've ever read the Odyssey, like it's kind of a minor part of the Odyssey where they tell something called the Cretan lie, where Odysseus kind of goes into detail about this expedition he took to Egypt, which
Yes,
beat for beat resembles some Egyptian tales about the Sea
because
People. So it's almost like
that's a
maybe like yeah, it's like a Mycenaean memory, because it's obvious that the Trojan
yes.
Wars, if it did happen, took place in the Bronze Age around the same time.
Well, what's very interesting to me is that's about when Minoan society kind of crumbles. Um,
Yes.
is towards the 1200s BC. Um, I heard a theory about like why that I think this is not correct because the dates are too far apart. But the idea that Mount Etna, which is I think a volcano in Greece, exploded, erupted and created like a
Uh,
small little ice age, which resulted in like mass crop failures across the entire Mediterranean, the northern Mediterranean, which caused this massive refugee crisis, which is
quite awesome.
very possible.
I
I
do
just think
know
the
whatever
eruption is far apart.
caused the Bronze Age collapse was climatic.
Oh yeah,
It was
absolutely.
a result of the decreasing arable capacity of the
Mhm.
but you both brought up really great points about how like entrenched this archaeological kind of fervor is in Israeli society. And you both kind of we kind of ridiculed this idea of like, oh, an archaeology park, like who would want to go to that? Like we imagine like some university or somewhere that's the archaeology park. But they no, I mean it's really like that. I mean they have like we have trivia like quiz shows. They have archaeology quiz shows. It's
That's
very
crazy.
like. But I mean, if you look up,
Jesus.
Israel Wikipedia and you look at their state seal, you look at their currency, postage stamps. I mean, it's all like these ancient, like kind of rough drawings that are basically being just, they're taking like a piece of paper and putting it over these shekels that they've dug up and just tracing it, and then they're making that into their currency. And but that has an effect on like, like it really kind of ties you to this ancient people. It puts them in your pocket, it puts them on your TV. It makes you associate with them and identify as them, really. As because you think, if I'm walking around the same place the ancient Israelites were, using the same currency, looks the same language and writing system, I mean, it's no wonder that these people are like later on I'll talk about Moshe Dayan, and he genuinely, like, he can't stop comparing, like, living in the past. Like, he can't remove himself from ancient Israel. It's just all around him. It's all so in his head, and just like completely, like, he's inundated with this, like, ancient Egypt and the shekels and then everything. We're digging it all up, and it's all under our feet. It's like he's living in this kind of the past, really, and he's doing that in order to justify his kind of almost existence in the present. And even beyond that, like the more basic, just like symbology of the state. Well, I guess I will say one more thing about the shekel, which I think I've explained this a couple of times, but Amos Elon writes in this essay that I read, that Menachem Begin will get on television during a period of hyperinflation in the 1980s in Israel, and he's just in his idea to fix it. Well, like, and this is probably over exaggerating. He probably did have real economic policies, but just this thing that he gets on the airwaves and just decides, yeah, the people will want to hear this. During when their food costs so much money, he gets on the airwaves and he says, well, we're gonna do. We're gonna rename the lira power, and like the proud, like the notoriety of the shekel as it exists in the Hebrew Bible. Like, it's in everybody's. He says it's going to make our currency way more valuable, on par with the U.S. dollar. So it's very like, and Elon says, there's a quote: "The cult of archaeological relics did much to determine the direction of Israeli culture." Depending on what they dig up, that's partially how they're going to base their direction in the future. Like the deep study on Masada or the kind of excavations at Hebron, they shape the way that Israelis are going to think about these places, and how they're going to, and the way that they think about these places in their culture is essentially how they're going to treat them, in their life, and deciding whether or not they belong to them or not. Did you want to say something, Jack?
Yeah, there was an article name I read, and this is short, but I think it's relevant. And the title of the article is "From Shrine to Forum," and I just think that's apt to kind of describe everything we're talking about.
And I mean, you would find, in Israeli backyards and front yards, you could find somebody who, hey, we were building our house and we found this Philistine altar. How cool is that? We got some flower pots on it now. It's like, it's very like it's fascinating for sure. And when they, I'm sorry, I just heard someone's voice outside my room. It's totally distracting. So yeah, they determine, and it does so much as to like almost consume the historical process itself. Israel, is some like Israeli historians recommended renaming, for example, the Iron Age the Israelite period, or the Byzantine Age the Talmudic period. It's like classifying history on the basis of Israel, like kind of not just centering their society, but centering even their like scientific worship of society around that same kind of, And so, I said this before, Neil Silberman, he puts, a tangible means of communion between people. You can feel connected. You can feel like you belong. You can, feel like an ancient Israelite by standing in the same place as them, by having the same currency, by doing all these different things, similarly.
Dude, we should not have struggled so hard with the title for this podcast. I mean, holy shit, communion with the past. trying to
Communion
form
with the
like any
Bulldawg
yes.
Talk. Bulldawg Talk.
Steelish shit. All very relevant. All very relevant and significant to
Digging up,
Israeli history.
digging through the
Saturday in
Bible.
Athens.
Hey, mine was I said it past, present. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Whatever
what
was
was the
left.
last
I
bit of
don't
that?
remember.
Past, present.
Well,
Pretty good title. Past,
uh,
present, prominent. Provenance,
Provenance.
I think.
Yeah.
Which
Provenance.
what the
Provenance.
fuck?
Provenance.
What the
but, you
fuck is
know,
Providence doing there, dude?
Past, present, and
and and
provenance.
and I
Wow.
forget which if either one of you mentioned kind of there was a kind of encouragement for Israelis to kind of go dig for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
You did,
Yeah.
and that
I
and
didn't.
amateur archaeology, and this is what I meant to call the national cult. This is amateur archaeology, but it plays hand in hand with regular archaeology. It's and so Elon calls it. I mean, he just the way he remembers it, growing up in Israeli society, uh, calls it like a sport, like fishing or hunting. It's very much something like a national pastime. Something that you go out and we looked at this book, me and Campbell did, about excavations on a Solomonic wall,
Hmm.
and even though this girl I think was related to the archaeologist actually working on it, the way she describes it is like she's going out to play soccer. Like I'm gonna go dig with the Palestinian kids, and we're gonna talk to the elders and stuff. And it's very like much this kind of you know I don't know. Like when I was a Boy Scout, we used to go like plant trees and stuff. That's kind of what I think. We're out digging in the thing. It's
Yeah,
kind
we're
of we're
having
trying to have
fun. Yeah.
fun. It's like a
I like that you call
pastime.
it fishing. I'm imagining like an Israeli guy in like fucking khakis going out with a hat that says "Women want me, artifacts fear me."
Oh my God.
Beautiful. No, it's I think and you did say it is top down. It is there's kind of this obsession because it is national identity, it's national legitimacy. Um, and so they talk about illegal archaeology a lot, which it's very damaging, very dangerous. You might call it tomb raiding. You might it's very like it's something that happened a lot. It's most famous in places like ancient Egypt, where we find these ancient tombs of Ramses the Great, the greatest Egyptian king who ever was, and had untold riches buried within him. We open his tomb and find nothing. It destroys the historical record. It keeps us that much further from being able to actually know what was going on in the past.
Actually,
And
we're
so
right
it's
there with Egypt. We have Assassin's Creed Origins, so
True.
mhm.
pretty detailed historical record.
Yeah, we got it. We figured it
Figured
out.
it out.
And and it's you could talk about amateur archaeology in like a general sense, but I really would like to focus on Moshe Dayan because just what a guy. I mean, like war hero for sure. I mean, like he fought for the Israelis in 1948 and led their forces in the Sinai, and he was missing an eye from operations before the 1948 war, and so was this battle scarred like general writing out. Um, of course, I don't want to make too many biblical connections, but of course the Israelite leaders in the period um, before the kind of official establishment of a monarchy in the region were called judges, which were these military leaders that would rise up at the time of need. I've got no doubt that Moshe Dayan probably thought of himself as kind of an Israelite judge. The way he talks in this very romantic, and this is to tie it back into kind of the Volkish ideal, very romantic writing, calling back to like the wonders and like a divining rock, the Red Sea this time just went across in our speedboats, and it's like, okay, dude, like we get it. He really feels at home in ancient Israel, and when he and so like when he does go to Sinai, he's looking around, he's trying to guess like, oh, this must be where Goshen was in the Bible. The locals say it's down here, but I think I know. That's what he writes in his book. He's like, I think I know it's 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 what more evidence do you need? This guy thinks he's an ancient Israelite. He thinks he can use his genetic method. I mean, maybe I'm going too far, but it's just anyway. So Dion, when he does invade the Sinai, he does loot the site of Serabit El Kadem, which is an Egyptian temple to Hathor, the god. Um, it's like, and I was reading an excerpt by a soldier who was under his command, the looting, and he called it like a heist. Like they pulled up, like had a helicopter ready, guys were standing guard outside,
So awesome.
making sure nobody came in,
What the
taking these,
fuck, dude?
massive stone monuments and pottery fragments, and just these things, and I think the biggest part of it is when you think of illegal archaeology, these guys are not doing this for the good of people. They're doing it for the good of their wallet or for the good of their collection.
I don't know if
Um,
any of this sort of like artifact hunting, archaeology, but artifact. I don't know if this has ever been done for good. Low key, feels like
it's
every time it's just like this is really bad. We should have done that.
you have so many archaeological finds throughout history that are just some guy was at like a dealer in like some marketplace and he bought like a pottery fragment, just so happened to say something
True.
insane. It's
It's
very much a trade in antiquities.
I,
Which
it's interesting that you bring that up. I think there's a really relevant. I mean, we always make the Native American connection, but right now there's like NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves and Repatriations Act. Um, and it's all about like getting the artifacts back to them because you talk about commodification as being a trade. Arrowheads are the most like souvenired thing in the world in America. Like that's every general store, every novelty shop sells arrowheads, it feels like. And obviously all of them are fake, but some of them aren't, and some of them get sold. And
yeah,
um,
and it's a lot of like kind of misidentification, and it's hard for an amateur to really go and dig up stuff and say with any certainty what it is. You're an amateur.
mm,
You don't really, I'm sure, Moshe Dayan was probably drilled in the finer points of the Bible, but could he identify what he was picking up out of the ground? Probably not.
sorry, I did. This is the other thing. This is the really relevant part about Native American graves. I think it's super interesting. Some of the artifacts included in NAGPRA are bones, human remains.
Mm.
We looted a bunch of graves and took a bunch of bones, and that's stuff that the tribes just don't have. And it's such like a direct, like overt, um, kind of embarrassing like means of genuinely severing the historical record. Um,
Yes,
it's
and
a very strong parallel to what's happening in Hebron at the West Bank or Gaza, the
yeah,
entire state of
Yeah,
Israel.
yeah.
and this scene with Moshe Dayan makes it sound very kind of professional. Like this guy was high up in society, he had connections, he could get stuff done for himself if he wanted. And for a time, that was true. He did engage in a lot of kind of illegal, especially I think he was at one point kind of a military governor in the West Bank as well. He engaged in several illicit. He actually injured himself pretty seriously during illegal archaeology expedition. And that's quite embarrassing. It's like, what are you doing out there, bud? Um, but
Don't call a doctor. Don't call a
there's
hospital.
the most embarrassing scene I can personally imagine was in the city of Azor. There was a Philistine cemetery, um, and it's I think it's near Tel Aviv, and an archaeologist was on the bus driving past the cemetery, and he looked out and he sees a guy digging by himself in the Philistine cemetery at night. So he gets off the bus, he walks, and he goes, "What?" And it's Moshe Dayan digging, doing like some like Tomb Raider stuff. Like, what are you doing, man? It's like, and he's trying to just robbing an ancient grave, just in broad, like out in the open, and obviously this guy's high up enough in society that he feels protected enough to do it. But he's not like throwing his weight around. He's just kind of this fervor in his mind that I have to get, even if I don't have my army helicopter, I need to get out there with a shovel and start just digging.
This is like George Washington leading the army to put down the whiskey revolution by himself.
Yes, it's
You
very
know,
like do it yourself.
get my hands dirty.
Yeah. And so there's a long battle, and there's lots of written like recording records like between Moshe Dayan and I Dam, and really just trying to like just prevent Moshe Dayan from doing any more damage to these ancient artifacts. And I'm like reading like the words. They're saying great sorrow, and then like being like a little like more like nice to him. Not a little damage, they say. They're very like stop like it's. And I read Dion's writings, and I can look at the book over there, but I could just open it up and any page and just talk about when I
Wasn't there
think of
that quote? I remember you saying that there's the quote like, look, no matter how bad Dion is, we just gotta let him do his thing.
yes, um, it's very like it's also a thing with members of Israeli parliaments. They do have some kind of it's like a kind of diplomatic immunity, but for their own country. Um, but in some cases, it is the best interest of the nation to like prosecute its highest leaders, all the time, especially ones as popular as Moshe Dayan as a war hero. And Dayan really kind of presented himself as like the like valiant, like I'm going to rescue the ancient artifacts, but when he rescues them, he doesn't take them to the museum. He takes them to his home. And he has this massive home filled with ancient artifacts all over the walls and through his yard, and just things that he's looted, from his own country and decorated his house with, to kind of, I don't know if it makes him feel more at home, but I think of, like average citizens were also doing this. It's really not unique to him, but it's, symptom of kind of a bigger, you know, I met, almost like a Masada complex just for in general, just like a straight up Israel complex, like an Israelite complex. Um, Finally, of course, Dion dies. Well, let me just when East Jerusalem was unified with Israel, uh, Amos Elon was there, and he said the forces and physical presence of the past were so palpable that it sometimes seemed the city failed to have a present. And I mean, talk about where is that more true than Israel? A country not built on a present ideal, but built on kind of an ancient legitimacy. Very much like it fails to have a president, and everything you look at it, its state seals, its state flag, its currency, its language, it's all this ancient relic that's been revived. It's not, it's hardly something new. But even though it's like tried, that's kind of was the idea. Was kind of if you think back to the beginning, the first settlers and the second Aliyah, they were kind of utopian. They were looking forward, looking for a new future, not trying to hold back onto the past. And
Yes.
so they reached even further into the past.
Well, I think,
Um,
and sorry to cut you off there, but I think, you know, we mentioned it being top down, but it's so prevalent. Like Ben Gurion said, um, now Israel must regain its past, and they must lose their innocence in order to do so. And obviously, their innocence, as we're seeing now, is slaughtering children, but they're also like there's Moshe Dayan, losing his innocence by grave digging or doing whatever. It's just like a bizarre obsession with reclaiming and retooling the past.
mhm. Yes, and it, in many ways that claiming is so personal that it really kind of ruins the historical record because people want to claim it for themselves. Have it's even more personal of kind of like I said, like a personal
Yeah.
communion with the land. Goes beyond kind of the societal. It's very much an individual action.
But it's kind of like an entire country of just Rome. Rome is the eternal city. They can't build a subway because every 10 feet is a Roman ruin. You walk towards the Colosseum, and it's just blocks of excavations
Yeah,
there. Um,
it's a city caught between two eras for
the
sure.
eternal city.
And it's very sad that it's, I mean, it's obvious that such a city is going to have so much conflict because of how important it is, but it's sad that such an important city has to lie where
Mm.
real scholarly investigation can't proceed as it would be elsewhere. It's unfortunate Jerusalem isn't in Missouri like the Mormons would want, but uh, I don't know.
I'm glad we managed to mention them once.
I know, I'm glad too.
Oh, we got.
Zion, we had to.
I think that's my checklist actually pretty much done. I think we got to everything.
Cool.
Yeah, I just if I wanted to just cap it off with the Dion story, he does
Sweet.
eventually die, and the artifacts. It's a question of what do we do with these artifacts? Like, um, they kind of offered them for sale, kind of like to break up the collection and sell to various museums and collections. But it becomes the question of like, we fought this guy for so long on illegal archaeology, illegal antiquities trade, and we're just gonna buy his illegally acquired artifacts. It kind of would be like defeat. And eventually that is what happens. Despite there being lots of reluctance and lots of just fighting over like whose fault is it that we let Dion do this for so long. And the damage continued to be felt after his death. Maybe not after his death, but also just during his activity. When I have this anecdote, archaeologist Raz Kletter relates. This couple from Kfar Yehoshua, they found some metal artifacts near their property and brought them to IDAM to be identified. When they were identified, they were found to be really rare, Bronze Age swords and vessels. And you think the Bronze Age in Israeli history is kind of the dark period. It's kind of the period where it's like the hazy like transition from the myths of Genesis into kind of the history recorded in like books like Chronicles or Numbers, where it actually does record some attestable kings. And it's kind of this hazy blur where the Bronze Age sits, where these kind of origins of this Israelite culture sit. And so those artifacts are obviously so very important to knowing the story of Israeli history. And this couple brings them in, and they're kind of disappointed. They're like, why do you guys want to keep this? Like, what if we want to have our own collection like Dion? Like our own national collection in our house, not one in your museum. And so Dion's not particularly unique. He's unique in his station and his ability to kind of have these massive heists, but he's not unique in his mindset. And if we want to point our fingers at anyone, point it back to Supanek and his kind of volkish ethno-nationalist kind of archaeological fervor that he creates, trying to raise spirits in the second Aliyah, and really redefining Israeli cultural expression, redefining how they deal with their neighbors, how they politically move forward. I mean, it's really kind of one of these fundamental pillars that props up this kind of idea of an Israeli society that we think today.
I think that's a good conclusion, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to say because I really don't. I don't want to do 15 more minutes of no offense.
No problem.
I'm really hungry, but I just this is the question. Based on what you said, like, do we think that such a shift was always destined to happen? I mean, how teleological do we want to be about this? Was like the initial kind of optimism always going to be a flash in the pan? Did this always have to take this route? Was it always going to be this sort of like connection? Did nationalism necessitate this?
Well, I guess if I would just take it, I would think back to like, I guess I would have to say yes. Such a country that's built on, kind of, if you think like the Uganda scheme, they didn't want to go live in Uganda. They didn't want to go live somewhere else. They wanted to go to the ancestral homeland of their ancestors. And such a connection after so many thousands of years of being separate can only be proven through archaeology. Their basis for even wanting that land in the first place has to be proven through kind of this a scientific method. And as we kind of get into this 20th century very kind of scientific methods for everything, especially for ethnography, as you said. It makes sense that such a development would occur. Maybe not to the fervor as it developed into, but I think that has to kind of do it. I think the Israeli psyche is probably really affected by having enemies on its borders and kind of being in this existential struggle. I think it really exacerbates everything for them.
Yeah, I mean, I also think the defining kind of thing that Jones has said about this was the self-selection thing. I mean, that you can't really underestimate the impact that has had, and I mean, those people reared certain kids with a certain tradition and perspective, and those kids reared, there's a fairly unbroken chain from that self-selection to the present day.
I definitely, you may be right. It might be a much different kind of country to look at had the first settlers been maybe more of a religious lay people, like a normal country, than a kind of hardworking, kind of utopian, forward-looking population like they got.
Well, what if? But gentlemen, I think we did good work here. This is a good discussion.
I think we did.
Glad to have had it with you.
It was fun.
Yes, I think we really got to the bottom of how archaeology drives kind of the movement of Israeli culture and society.
That's our thesis.
Yeah, it is.
Very well.
All right.
Well, thank you for
Signing
joining
off.
us on
Thank
Bulldawg
you guys
Talk.
so much.
Until next
catch
time.
us next time.
Keep digging.
Catch us next time where we do an episode about the history of oil.
No.
Yes.
No.